Hello, I am Cody Allingham, and this is the Transformation of Value podcast. Today I talk with Darcy Ungaro. Darcy is a financial advisor, a Bitcoiner, and he also hosts the NZ Everyday Investor podcast. This episode is very much a crossover where we talk about our views on Bitcoin and what the future may look like. Wealth and investment planning strategies traditionally involve things like real estate, stocks, and KiwiSaver. But for many people, these pathways are no longer realistic options, and more people are seeking out alternatives, such as Bitcoin. Now, there is a lot going on out there. It sometimes seems like we're entering a brave new world where things will never be the same again. As the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "Consider frequently how swiftly all things which exist are swept away and carried off." Perhaps it is the change presented by an unchangeable money called Bitcoin that will help us move in a better direction. If you want to get in touch with me, please send an email to hello@thetransformationofvalue.com and I will get back to you. I do hope you enjoy this episode. If you would like to support the show, please consider streaming some Satoshis via your favorite podcasting 2.0 platform such as Fountain or Breeze. Otherwise, on to the show. Oh, that's way better. What have you just turned off?
I turned off the musician option.
Yeah, I'm sorry, man. So that
That's
first
okay.
bit, there was a bit of echo, but hey, it's good. We can kind of get the juices flowing.
Okay, cool. So should we start again?
Yeah, man. What did I even open with?
You just said, just catching up locally in real life again is awesome. You caught up with Simon and realizing how many people are into Bitcoin and what's your Bitcoin journey.
Yeah. Okay. Let me just restart that.
Cool. Just relax the shoulders, breathe.
Yeah. So yeah, I think for me the really fascinating thing has been meeting with Bitcoiners in New Zealand in real life and having these conversations with them and realizing that there's many people out there who are asking some pretty pointy questions around what's happening with the monetary system in this country and globally. People who are interested in alternative ways of preserving their wealth through time, and certainly talking with Simon Collins recently, who you interviewed on your show as well, and I had him on my podcast, understanding that there's people out there who are building in this space, really opened my mind up to the options with Bitcoin. I had been looking at it for a little bit before then and playing around sort of on my own, learning about it. But I'd love to sort of hear what your story was and how you began to get involved and interested in this space.
Yeah, great. So I think, as you would know, when you prepare for a podcast, you have to do a bit of research. And part of that involves not looking at the mental imagery that you project for yourself to understand things and passing judgment on your perception of reality, but actually putting all that stuff aside, all that baggage that comes with it, and just looking at things as plainly as you can for what they really, really are. And in 2017, I had the opportunity to catch up with a fellow by the name of Sam Blackmore, who at the time had a business called My Bitcoin Saver, which was a crypto on and off ramp, very similar, I guess you could say, to Easy Crypto today. And I was using them as a provider shortly after my session with Sam on the podcast. But as part of the research that I was doing, I had to put away my preconceived notion, or this projection, this mental imagery of what I thought Bitcoin was, which was just a bunch of digital pokery and fake stuff that was invented in the internet, basically a scam. Kind of like that was the early sort of cynical view on Bitcoin, and I've fully adopted it because I'm 100% into mainstream traditional finance. Back in 2017, being a financial advisor for 20 years, talking to people about getting debt, buying property, investing in KiwiSaver. That's it, right? That's where all the revenue was coming from my business. And so that's all I was really focusing on as I was building up my business. I didn't have any room for anything experimental or anything too creative or anything that actually almost threatened the status quo of how my business was operating. So I was naturally quite closed-minded around this, right? But when I put all that aside, I looked for what it is. I kind of got it. The penny dropped. I realized that, hey, this is just digital scarcity, much like we have scarcity with land. Totally into property investment, still am. And what's great about property is that you can't create more of this sphere, more of this earth, right? Yes, you can go up to a certain extent, but you can't go wider. That's where the scarcity is. And so that's why land is so amazing to invest in it. And if there's a house on top of it to help pay for the mortgage required to buy the land, even better.
Yeah.
But in the Bitcoin space, as soon as I understood in a similar way, there was digital scarcity, that's when the penny dropped for me, and I started dollar cost averaging in from 2017 using my Bitcoin saver back then, and the rest is history. As I put more in, I learned more because I was taking it far more seriously. Like those who don't have any skin in the game, of course they're going to be cynical, but as soon as you start putting skin in the game, it becomes a lot more real, doesn't it?
Yeah. Oh, I think there's a couple of things there. I think the first one that's really important to identify is that New Zealand, for the most part, has never had a currency crisis. We've had stock market crashes. There was a few big ones sort of before my time. But certainly in terms of money, New Zealand's always kind of had it pretty good. We've always been in a beneficial situation. Wars could happen, and New Zealand was relatively safe. And so we've never had the failure of our currency. We've seen it go through a couple of periods. We had the New Zealand pound, the New Zealand dollar, decimalisation, all of that. But we've never experienced a currency crisis. And so I think there's a certain degree of naivety, and perhaps you could call it hubris, around the way money works in this country. And I've got a good friend from Zimbabwe, and he moved to New Zealand when he was 15 years old. And he gave me recently a $500 million Zimbabwean dollar as a bit of a gift. And he's like,
Wow.
Cody, you're a millionaire now. And, you realize, I mean, that was an extreme case, but you realize, that currencies and all fiat currencies eventually fail. It's just, the fact. And even that word fiat, maybe a lot of people don't know what that means, but it's money that's not backed by anything. And this is quite a paradigm shift to begin to even understand what this means, right? Money is money, but actually what is money is the big question. And, I think with something like land, or even, securities, stocks, ownership of a company, you've got this tangible thing on the other side. And it's something that's redeemable, it's tradable, it's physical. The challenge with Bitcoin for a lot of people is that though it is tangible, it's not physical. It is a digital thing. But because it is digitally scarce, and it's the first time we've ever seen digitally scarce assets, it's a little bit of a different way of looking at it. And I think that's what is hard for a lot of people, especially traditional investors, to sort of grok what that means. But certainly, I think there is a status quo in investing in New Zealand, certainly. I mean, you look at housing, you look at sharesies, you look at this, the KiwiSaver. There's these kind of go-tos, these gold standards, even though they're not gold standards, but, these go-tos for where you invest your money. And I think that can be quite problematic because everyone's sort of just following what the neighbours are doing, and they're not really looking for that asymmetric opportunity or really growth opportunity. They're sort of just saying, oh, we just want to keep our head above water and go from there. You know what I mean?
Totally know what you mean. And I always struggle around this, to be honest, because I'm not from New Zealand natively. I've lived here for 30 years, mind you. I'm not that old, but I've lived more of my life here than I have in Canada, where I'm from. So, but I guess I mentioned that because it feels a little bit easier in a way to spot the difference, because I can still remember a different culture, a different way of thinking. And but I struggle, I guess, talking about it because it can come across as a little bit patronizing, I guess you could say, if I was to make comment on anything about New Zealand culture, because I don't feel like I properly own it. And so I have to be really careful with how I pitch this, because I still think New Zealanders are the best people in the world, and this is the best country to be in the entire world. And I come from a pretty cool country, I think. But I will every day choose to be in this country over where I came from. No problem. So in a sense, I know that I actually value this place a lot more than some locals do.
Yeah.
But I think when it comes to following the herd, I don't know why. Maybe it's the sheep. We take our cue from everybody else rather than what we have seen with our own eyes. And it comes down to this whole thing, getting rid of our preconceived notions and our paradigms that we view the world through, and actually looking things as what they are.
Yeah. Shining a light on it. And I admire you for that, because one thing that's quite common in the Bitcoin space is that the people who should, or the people who ought to understand it the best are the ones who are least willing to even take a look at it. And that includes people who are involved in traditional finance, people who are involved in software engineering, people who you would think, man, they must get it. And in fact, it's the people who you wouldn't expect who are most likely to get it. So, for example, farmers are very open and understand Bitcoin. They get it.
Yeah, that's right. They do.
And I've interviewed a few people who are involved in, who work on the land and that on my show, and they get it because for them, how many head of sheep or cattle that you've got, that's real, that's value, that's money that is in the bank effectively. It's not a derivative. It's not this financialized abstraction. It's real.
No, that's right. Those are little biological miners out there in the field, right? And they're on land that hopefully they own. They get physical precious metals. They get Bitcoin better than most people. I don't know why either.
Yeah. I mean, they understand gold and that as well very well. So I've found that those sorts of people can understand a lot better, or people who have maybe been marginalized by the traditional system. And I would include people like myself in that system because, I mean, certainly I've been priced out of the housing market in this country. I've seen what it was like for my parents and my grandparents, and it's just a totally different situation where you've got an average house price of $1 million or whatever it is, and you think that's just ridiculous. Like for a moldy state house in Upper Hutt, you're going to pay $1 million. Like I just cannot believe that, and we're seeing that correction in that space, but still the fact that it went there goes to show that was where money was pooling, value was pooling in these assets, and that sort of, I think, is the way value, the system has been optimized for value to these assets to be financialized, and in a way that they really shouldn't have been. They weren't suited to it. I mean, housing's, it's not portable. It's, very difficult to liquidate. It's, there's a lot of challenges with it, and not to add to that, but there's also government restrictions on building new houses. There's a whole lot of complexity to it, which means it was a good investment for many people, but for many others you can't even get started with it. Whereas with Bitcoin, you can buy $50, $100, you can get started. It's very easy, very liquid, and it's designed from the beginning to be money. It's not something else that's been co-opted as a financial asset because the money is broken. And so I think that sort of paradigm shift, as you say, and looking at it quite straight on and really, opening your eyes to what's going on and realizing that there is change in the air. And I think that's probably the biggest thing that I've taken away from these last few years is that, things aren't going to be the way they were. And in fact, we're never going to go back to the way things were. And so we need to look at what, and this is something you said to me earlier, what is the crisis and what is the opportunity that is coming downrange, and how can we successfully engage with that when it does arrive?
That's right. I think it's so perceptive. You mentioned before we pushed record that you're probably more, you would describe yourself as a creative person, and I'm blown away by that. Just hearing you speak, you're obviously, you get this a lot more than the people that should get it. Like people that do what I do should get this. Yet it's the creatives, those that are, like you say, those that are marginalized or you feel marginalized, right? And it kind of speaks to this broader theme of, this is kind of what I believe is potentially unfolding in the crisis opportunities or the crisis and opportunity paradigms that we see, or the spheres of crisis and opportunity buckets that we see all kind of converging right now, is this theme that the first will be last, the last will be first. And it's like a rotation, or it's a flippening around this axis of hubris, right? Where the status quo, the incumbent, the already is going to be challenged by the not yet, or the not quite mature, but already way more capable than the mature. And those on the outside will be on the in because they looked at things for what they were, not something else that they were told by somebody else, right? They were actually individual people thinking for themselves. And if we can harness that change rather than be steamrolled by it, that's the stance. It's so simple. Like we will so easily freak out like a possum in the headlight and just stand still and just stare at negativity. Some of us will be fascinated too much by it. Some of us will bury our head in the hand because the light is just too bright. We ignore it. Either way, we get steamrolled by it because we're looking at it. We're looking at the negative side of it. Yet on the other side of that coin, in equal measure, is an amazing opportunity. And with Bitcoin, it's a perfect example of this, that the disruption that we're completely ignorant of here in New Zealand, especially because we've never had a currency crisis, that starting to impact the rest of the world a lot more. We can see examples of it. We can see all the pieces moving in place geopolitically. If we actually stop watching our local news and look a little bit more internationally, you can see this happening right now. And if we can position ourselves to harness the change rather than be a victim of it, we will be prosperous.
Yes.
With what? Well, we have to be open-minded with what that new wealth for the new world looks like, and genuinely be open-minded, not always translate it into fiat currency denominated wealth. But if we're open to adopt a new definition of what real wealth is for the new world, I think we can actually get some of it, which is pretty cool.
And I've got two little stories to share with you that I think will illustrate sort of my perspective on this. So I'm here in Wellington. I'm in the capital city. I walked down to the dairy just down the road to pick up some milk for the office, for the coffee machine.
Good man.
2 litres of milk, Fonterra Blue Top, $6.70. $6.70 for 2 litres of milk. And I thought to myself, this is hyperinflation. This is ridiculous. And I went to pay, and the FPOS machine didn't work. And I tried another card, it didn't work. So I had to open up my wallet, get out a $10 note, Kate Shepherd, gave it to the lady in the dairy, and we made our transaction. And so there was 2 major failings there. There was the FPOS network didn't work, and then there was the ridiculous price of what I would consider a basic commodity. And then I'm going to contrast that with another story. I had a podcast, I recorded a show last night with a young Maori lawyer, talking about how Bitcoin can enable a lot of self-sovereignty and a lot of independence for small Maori communities in New Zealand.
Awesome.
And she wasn't super familiar with Bitcoin. I asked her to download Wallet of Satoshi onto her iPhone. It took about 5 seconds. I asked her to hold it up to her screen while we were doing the video chat, and I scanned the QR code that appeared on her phone, and I sent her $10 worth of Bitcoin. And that transaction...
Buy some milk.
Yeah. And that transaction happened without any third party involved. That transaction happened without any fees. That transaction happened totally peer-to-peer. And for me, that really illustrates the difference that we're seeing and the 2 paths that are before us. We have one which is a legacy system, which is under its own weight, it feels like it's starting to collapse. And the other one is this new lightweight peer-to-peer system for transacting value globally. And not everyone's aware of the full extent of what's possible technically, because we use something called the Lightning Network, which sits on top of Bitcoin. There's a little bit of technical detail there, but basically that's going to be what everyone uses in the future, I believe. And the fact that knowledge is not distributed evenly. Many people are not even aware that what Bitcoin is, let alone what some of these layer 2 technologies are like. For me, shows that there's a real asymmetric opportunity here. And I think there's a certain kind of normalcy bias where if you look at what everyone's always done, it takes a long time to change those habits. And I mean, to be fair, New Zealand was one of the first countries to adopt FPOS back in the 80s, I believe. Mm-hmm. So we've had sort of these periods of change, but then they ossify and they start sort of that they become the status quo. And I think these ideas of things like KiwiSaver, of housing, of the different ways of preserving your wealth have become ossified, and they've become dogmatic. Housing, you can never go wrong, even though we're seeing 15% slump in housing. Stocks, you can never go wrong, even though we're seeing massive quantitative easing that's injecting this money, and some are winning and some are losing. It's the recipe isn't working anymore, and I think people are starting to wonder why the cake doesn't taste so good.
That's really well said. And back in 2009, so Bitcoin, roughly 13 years old, born out of the global financial crisis. Obviously, there was a sign back then that what you just said was happening. Yet it's taken 13 years for you and I to have this conversation.
Well, I was born of the financial crisis in the sense that was the beginning of my career. That was the beginning of my university days. I didn't know anything else. And in fact, it was so difficult, Darcy, that I ended up having to leave New Zealand. I moved over to Japan. I was working in Japan for many years, and I thought, there was nothing here. And I know it's tough for young people today, but even back then, there was no jobs in Wellington. I tell you, like, at least now, there's a lot of stuff you can do. And if you haven't got a job, you can drive Ubers, you can do that sort of thing. But there wasn't even that back then. And it wasn't purely because of the financial crisis. I think there was a few other factors involved, but I couldn't wait to get out. I was itching to get out. And coming back today, it's like, well, things are a little bit better, but they're also worse in other regards. And New Zealand never felt the full brunt of it. Like, I imagine Canada and the United States were really quite heavily hit by that. But yeah, it's certainly, I mean, we're feeling the echoes of it today for real.
Oh, absolutely. And I think it's kind of like a D-Day versus V-Day sort of thing. Like, there was a turning of the tide back in 08, 09, where we realized things are dying, but it's not dead yet. And it still might not be dead. Like, the existing financial system specifically is what I'm referring to. It's still not dead. It's still functioning. It's still fine. And it's still possible to build wealth through traditional means. And I think for the most part, it would be, in my view anyway, and this is me talking as a financial advisor, it would probably be unwise to completely throw away the status quo. But you'd certainly want to draw a line somewhere between 0 to 100 and choose a number that represents the likelihood that the past will continue on into the future, much as it always has been. And then choose a number, therefore, on the other side of that, that represents the possibility that things will never, ever, ever, ever be the same again. And the faster we can get on with that, the better. That's basically how to split your portfolio, in my view. So for me personally, I choose 80-20. So 80%, things will continue on much as it always has been. I'll invest accordingly. 20%, things are never going to be the same. And I just need to sit tight and wait for it to happen, because if I've allocated my 20% thoughtfully and correctly, and I believe I have, and I've done everything I can to reduce the risks present with that alternative strategy, then it's just a matter of time. The benefit from that, not necessarily expressed in fiat currency, will make itself known over time if I'm right. Now, I might be too conservative. I might be too aggressive. I don't know. But it's a number that I had to choose. And I think that's kind of how we need to think about this, is almost partition our brain around the two realities, the two ways that things go forward.
Yeah, well, I think the other thing to look at as well is you're obviously in a different life stage to me. And so, that ratio is different. But, for myself, there's no way housing is an option.
You'd probably invert it, wouldn't you?
Yeah. I mean, housing, it's simply not even a consideration for me. And I look at comparing apples with apples, what I could get in Japan, what I could get in other parts of the world for what I would be paying in New Zealand, it's not even worth thinking about. Like, in fact, there's places, Nagasaki, different parts of Japan, where in fact you can get a house pretty much for free. You just have to pay the land tax on it.
Wow.
I lived in Japan for 5 years, and I got to know a lot of these sort of places. I did a lot of photography and a lot of creative work in rural Japan, and they have farmhouses. They've got farmland that no one wants to live there. Everyone's moving to Tokyo, and they're giving them away, and you just have to fill out a bit of paperwork. And so it's like there is options globally. And I think this also reflects a broader change, which is also this kind of connection to the nation state, which sounds a bit kind of woo-woo, but I mean, I certainly felt like there was a stab in the back with the way New Zealand was 2008, 9, 10. There was no jobs. There was nothing for me as a young person coming up. And I left, and I had this great opportunity to work. I built a career overseas. Now I've come back, and it's like, I always had these dreams that New Zealand, it was always in my heart and, as my home. But then I came back, and I've had 3 years of insanity, 3 years of 7%, 6-7% inflation, roads are broken, infrastructure's falling apart. At least in Japan, I can take a bullet train from Tokyo to Osaka in a couple of hours. Here, it's like, you're going to take a bus to Auckland, or a train. What train? It's my home. I love this place, but it's crumbling. It's falling apart, and I feel that it's not because of any of us. It's because there's some systematic challenges and problems with the way we've invested for the future, the way we've invested in infrastructure, and all of that I feel comes back to what I would call time preference. And so again, that's where we come back to life stages. For myself, I've got a very long time preference now, and Bitcoin's really helped develop that. I'm thinking, okay, what's going to happen in 10 years? What's going to happen in 20 years? That's what I'm trying to build for. I'm not interested in making a quick buck. I'm already poor. I don't, nothing's going to change that in the short term. But what I can do is start building for a longer term future. And I think that's part of this bigger change that and I feel this from a lot of my friends and peers, is that they don't want the short term thing. They don't want the short term credit to buy stuff they don't really need. They would rather sort of knuckle down, invest for the future, and build a better world for themselves. If that makes sense, sort of
totally
changing attitudes towards value and time preference.
And I think you've caught on to something that I've been learning a little bit more about time preference a lot, thanks to Saif ad-Din Amos, The Bitcoin Standard.
Yep.
That book is just phenomenal.
Yep.
Look at that. You got it in your hand right there.
Yeah.
And a lot of those principles, and just like the principles of Austrian economics, just really naturally, I guess, resonate with me, and completely contrary to what I would have learned in university. It seems to be the antidote for what we really need. And it kind of speaks to what you were saying before there. Like I kind of look at any organizational structure as obviously it's just a collection of people. It's almost like hands on a Ouija board, right? Sometimes you don't know what's going to come out of it. And it's a bit spooky how it acts. It takes on a life of its own. I'm talking specifically about government here now, but we are under the influence of an organization that, as much as we like to influence it for better, it has this natural tendency to take us to places which aren't always in our best interest. And we now have realms that are growing around us where we can almost leave that without physically leaving it. Like, we can leave the financial system now. We couldn't do that before.
Yeah.
We can leave it digitally. We've got this artificial intelligence that's taking off, which means we can literally be other places. We're having a conversation across the country that we couldn't have before, and it feels like I'm in the same room with you. That didn't happen before. Like, the work situation isn't relevant anymore. You can work anywhere you want now. It's disruptive, but it's also amazing because we can now legitimately come out from underneath what is not necessarily in New Zealand, but in many places across the world, oppressive government regimes that seek to purposefully exploit those that they are supposed to serve. And that is a spectrum disorder. And to assume that in New Zealand we're immune from that would be folly to the extreme.
Yeah.
But I don't know how. I wouldn't want to comment on where we're at in that spectrum, but I would suggest that we need to be mindful of it.
Yeah, well, I think what Bitcoin really represents, and I also just want to clarify as well for any listeners, there's a huge difference between sort of quote unquote crypto and Bitcoin, and it's just worth dwelling on that for a second. But there's a lot of, Bitcoin was the first. It came out, the white paper was released in 2008, and then it started properly in 2009 and started running. And at that point, its settings and its core values were locked in terms of the supply of Bitcoin, the fixed supply, all of those key things that make it valuable. Everything else that came after was a copycat and was never able to reproduce that initial kickoff that, because for a long time Bitcoin didn't have any value. For a couple of years then, they were giving them away. So it had this natural opportunity for price discovery, which every other so-called crypto has tried to kind of copy. And people who maybe are not really sure of the technical differences, they think, well, I've missed Bitcoin, but I can get this next other thing. That is not the case. Bitcoin is the only thing that matters. Everything else is, at the very best, a knockoff, and at the very worst is an outright scam. Security, there's no... a lot of them have centralized governing groups who can kind of control the supply and that sort of thing. Bitcoin is fully decentralized. So I think that's just worth clarifying. But really what I think it is it presents an optionality, and it presents a place that you can now stand and look at the existing system with. And I've got another little story for you. So the other night I caught up with some of my Wellington friends. So the four of us went over to their flat, and we're all about the same age, sort of late 20s, early 30s sort of thing. And we all sat there and we were laughing and thinking, you know what, we should all have our own homes. We should all have families. We should all be, doing well. And yet here we are in a cold, mouldy Wellington flat, eating Shrewsbury's and drinking cheap beer. And I think there's something about that which, New Zealanders, especially people who are maybe a little bit older, fail to sort of see, and they think, well, that's something for students, that's something for young people who are trying to find their way. But there's a certain emerging reality now that a lot of people are really, locked out. They're renters for life. They're wage earners. They're not really able to build any wealth. And you look at New Zealand's wages, salaries in the OECD, they're not anything special. In fact, I think they're pretty low. I'm very lucky. I can do work sometimes for American companies and that, so I'm able to get US dollars. And I feel like I'm this I'm doing this arbitrage. It's like, yeah, I'm getting some juicy USD because certainly the New Zealand dollar doesn't go very far at all. And I think there's a certain kind of blindness to what's going on. And so you're talking about this kind of spectrum of countries. You've got on one hand, strife and civil war, and on the other hand, kind of this golden utopia. But actually, I think New Zealand's issues, they're understated. We have a pretty cohesive society, but there's certainly cracks forming, and you just have to look at some of the things happening in Auckland. You've got these ram raids, you've got this violence, you've got these things on the edges that, before they weren't really there, but they're on the periphery, and they're becoming more and more apparent. Every day you open up the newspaper, you open up your news, you see another ram raid in Hamilton, Auckland, Kumeu, Pukekohe. You see some, issues with homeless people, issues with substance abuse, and these are not things that happened to my New Zealand to this degree when I was a kid, and I'm pretty sure, I wasn't looking as closely as I am now, and there's always been issues, but these emergent social things, I think they are a direct outcome of this systematic failure that's taking place. And New Zealanders are good people, and so they'll try their best to make it work for as long as they can. In fact, most people on earth, I think, are good people, and they'll make it work. But you get to a breaking point when people lose hope, and that's when you start running into issues, I think. And I don't think we're there yet, but in many parts of the world, they're already at that place.
And it can change. Like I moved to New Zealand first, 1986. So I had an opportunity to look at the imprint of the recent history, not the recent history, of course, because that was before my time, but I could see kind of remnants or reminders that New Zealand went through something not too dissimilar to what we kind of feel right now. Obviously very different, but around the Springbok tour, there was a lot of heightened anxiety and I guess a bipolar view in many areas, and that kind of erupted into an event there. This is different, but it's the same in a way, because culturally we're the same people, or sort of half of us are the same people, I guess. There's a lot of new arrivals, myself included, but there is an echo, I think, of that you kind of almost need to remove a little bit to see what could happen next. But you're right, like these are signs and symptoms. These are the effects. These are the I guess the signposts that are pointing to structural shifts and tensions that are beneath the surface that will break out.
Yeah.
And I remember talking about this on the podcast, probably like there's so much stuff that I've talked about over about 5 years that scares the crap out of me, because I was just going to a creative space and I was talking about things that a lot of this stuff is now coming to play. And I don't call myself a prophet. I'd like to think this is a not-for-profit organization, but it feels spooky, just like the level of angst that a growing population in New Zealand is feeling. And you were kind of touching on it before with your circle of friends. I would say that you're not a fringe member of society by any means. You're probably indicative of a very large and growing group of people that feel alienated and pushed aside.
Yeah.
And that will come to a head. And it's not necessarily a problem that politicians can solve for us as much as we would like to expect them to, and we might vote accordingly and fall for the promises. And I'm saying that because we're in an election year. To a certain extent, I would say that it is the regulation itself that has caused the need for more regulation. It's a drug.
Well, certainly. And again, I'm in Wellington. I see it every day. I literally walk past the Reserve Bank. I walk past the Beehive, and on the way to work, and I see the apparatus of government and of the state. And obviously that's, New Zealand's always had that bedrock of a parliamentary system, and that, we haven't, again, we're naive. We haven't had coup d'etat. We haven't had really in recent times anything close to civil war or internal conflict. There was a period before really the development of the parliamentary system and that, where there was, regional conflict, as New Zealand was being colonised, but as New Zealand is today in this current format, it hasn't seen any of that turmoil. Again, we're an island in the South Pacific, very disconnected from everything else. And so there's a certain degree of political naivety. And I believe spending time overseas, I've been to Japan, I've been to China, I've been to many parts of Asia, and, you understand the history of change and how it can just happen. And I mean, for example, Japan, people think, man, if you've been to Japan, it's, people think this is the loveliest place in the world. These are the nicest people in the world. But people don't realize in the 1930s, it was a junta. They had several high-profile assassinations of prime ministers, of members of staff. The military, the military took over the government and they went into the war. It was a huge period of turmoil. After the war, they had the student riots in the 1960s. And there was a lot of these historical things which people think, no way, Japan could never do that. But yeah, peaceful, lovely Japan has that history. Other parts of the world have that history. And what you have is you have that moment, and the sort of that opportune moment. The Greek word for it is kairos, the right time for something to happen, as opposed to chronos, which is just the kind of the clock time. And that kairos, that time, opportune time, I believe, we're seeing that emerge now. We've got an election year. We've got massive, discontent, I think, with people. We've got still the amnesia of the COVID pandemic era, and the sort of, the shock from that is still, I think, with a lot of people. And what does that lead to? I don't know. New Zealand's a very peaceful place, very lovely people, very caring people, I think, but certainly if you make enough people unhappy, and most importantly, if you remove hope, I think that's when people start thinking, well, there's nothing here for me.
Totally. Yeah. Those that have nothing to lose and those that have everything to lose, put them in the same room.
Yeah. And I think that the traditional, and we shouldn't dwell on this too long, but I think the traditional dichotomy, the traditional sort of analysis of this is that it's a political problem. It's, an us versus them problem. It's neighbor against neighbor. And I really feel that that's a flawed analysis. And, but I can see why it's easy to do that. I grew up in a place called Flaxmere in Hawke's Bay. It's a very, very poor place. You go up to the Bay of Plenty, go up to Tauranga, and you see the beautiful big houses. Everyone's got the boats, the jet skis, and you think, how could I ever even think about having that, let alone, even a house. And I mean, that's an insidious idea, but I accept it because these are still my people. These are my family. These are my friends. That's not, I don't want to have that conflict. I don't want it to be a political thing. I don't want it to be left versus right. I don't want it to be about any of that, because we are one people. What it is it's a systematic issue around the way the monetary system works, I believe. And so Bitcoin represents optionality. It represents a fixed supply of money. You've got it. You either have it or you don't. And your Bitcoin and my Bitcoin, as the value increases over time, they both increase at the same time. You're not more privileged than me because you're a chief executive of a bank, but also our former Prime Minister, John Key. You're not more privileged than me because you work in government and you're able to get the money before anyone else. People familiar with the Cantillon effect will know that the closer you are to the money printer, the more likely you are to be able to purchase hard assets than you will be to someone like, if you're working for wages. There's a lot of these systematic inequalities, which I think they're not political problems, they're systematic issues that if you try to fix it politically, you just you sow more discontent, if you know what I mean. And I think,
you're getting to the root cause of the problem, right? Which is where the root solution, not the root cause of the problems, but the core solution, which is fix the money, fix the world, right?
Yeah. And that's something a lot of Bitcoiners say, fix the money, fix the world. And it's a simple change, you just start using Bitcoin.
Yeah.
You start accepting it. You start thinking in Bitcoin.
Yeah.
Stop thinking in dollars.
Well, it's a vote, isn't it? Every time you're taking your fiat currency and you're translating it into Bitcoin, you're voting for the change that you really want, because you're actually taking your power that's been bestowed upon you through this fiat currency system, which is kind of, some would say it's a little bit phony, and you're translating that into something that's effectively more real, certainly more real for the world that we're going into. So naturally, if you're doing that translation, if you're playing that time arbitrage right now from the already to the not yet, naturally we'll have more influence, and naturally things will have to evolve around those that own the wealth.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the way it is now, which some of us don't like. But we have a chance. We have a chance to actually make that decision. But I guess my frustration is that most of the people I talk to, they don't get it. They still think that it's actually about gaming the system to make more money, make more fiat currency, rather than escaping or translating into a new system that will give them more of what they really need for the new future.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's a difficult thing, right? Like you've been to Japan, right? And I'm sure the first time that you went there, you were translating yen back to New Zealand dollars for the first long time, until eventually you're just like, well, stop it. It's all about yen because I'm in this new country. I got to think like this.
Yeah.
And it was when you started to do that that you really started to get it, probably, right? Like how people do make it work over there.
Yeah. And I think it's important. I've got a bit of a lens which I'll share with you around how I look at this, because I mean we're talking about Bitcoin today, but really what does it mean? What is its value proposition? And I think we must clearly look at the way the world is going. The internet has become central to all of our communications. I'm talking to you right now over the internet. I run my business over the internet. Our lives are effectively run over the internet today. And no matter who you are, I think you can see that. And so what we're seeing is Bitcoin is money for a internet connected world. And though we have had the internet for some time, it didn't have this penetration and absolute coverage that it has today. And so the way I like to think of Bitcoin is a bit of a matrix, right? So on one hand, we've got hyperlocal and hyperglobal. It's two kind of modes of engagement. Me sitting in the room next to you, but also me talking to someone on the other side of the world, hyperlocal, hyperglobal. And then the other two on this matrix are micro transactions and macro transactions. And between those four quadrants, I believe Bitcoin is able to solve and provide a very powerful way to send value between any of those in a way that you can't do with fiat money. So, for example, I can run my podcast. People can send me tiny amounts of Bitcoin. They can stream it to me using the Lightning Network. And that's a hyperglobal transaction for hyperglobal micro transactions. Just in the same vein, if I want to build a website or an API or something that people can engage with, maybe I have a small, 1 Satoshi, 10 Satoshi, paywall to engage with that. And it's worth mentioning, so there's 21 million Bitcoin. Each Bitcoin has 100 million Satoshis inside it. So think of them as sort of dollars or cents, effectively. So you've got these global transactions that can happen instantaneously with no fees. If you try doing that with credit cards, you've got a 3% fee. You've got minimum charges of like $1-2. With Bitcoin, you can send 0.1 cents, globally. So that's hyperglobal. But then you've also got macro transactions, hyperglobal, settlements between banks and nation states. You can send $1 billion of liquidity, and the system doesn't care. It just does it. It's not even a blip in the price. You can send $100 million using your phone. There's no paperwork. There's no big wire transfer things to fill out. There's no scrutiny on that. You can just do it. And then you've got hyperlocal. I can send you Satoshis over my phone. I can send, I can pay for a car. I can buy secondhand goods with some Satoshis, with some Bitcoin locally. And so all four of those can be connected. And that's really because it's internet native. You can't do that with fiat money. Even today, try getting out $5,000 in cash to pay for something. They're not going to let you do it. Try paying for, we want to buy a secondhand car. You got to go to the bank and book in a time to withdraw that amount of money.
That's right. They don't hold more than a certain amount. Sometimes it could be $5,000. Sometimes it could be 30 grand, but you don't know. Yeah.
And at the same time, I've got friends. I was on a call yesterday with another couple who are based in El Salvador, and I sent I'm able to send them a little bit of Bitcoin over the Lightning Network instantaneously. El Salvador doesn't even have its own real banking infrastructure, but I can still use Bitcoin in the Lightning Network. I've got friends in other parts of the world who I can send Bitcoin to, and all I need is that QR code, that Bitcoin address, and we're able to transact. There's no barriers, and that really, I think that's the power that I'm beginning to allude to. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I'm curious as well, Cody. Like you are you're irresponsibly long in terms of your commitment to this space, to quote Raoul Paul. You are either experimenting or using. I don't know anything about this, but you mentioned before this the micropayments thing. Can you just unpack that a little bit for me? Because I'm really curious about, and I've heard of Nostr. I don't fully get it. I'm early on in my learning around that, but I'm also thinking about my own podcast, my own content creation. I'm aware that there's this coming struggle, I think, around what we can talk about, especially as it relates to finance. I really think that there's going to be coming a time where you and I having a conversation like this could be as dangerous as talking about the event that happened in a few years ago and having different views on that. And so, like, how does this work? How do you actually get paid to create content in sats or satoshis?
Yeah, well, I think breaking it down to start with, think of it as layers. And so this core layer that we have for how I'm communicating with you right now, and so the theme of communication, the core layer of that is the internet. That's cables laid underneath the ocean. It's TCP/IP. It's all of this infrastructure, and then on top of that, you've got the web, you've got Zoom, you've got email. You've got these layer 2s and these layer 3s that are built on top of that. So that sort of layered approach is very important to think about. You can't build on day one back in the 80s or the 70s. You couldn't have had Zoom because the technology wasn't there. You're trying to build Zoom straight away. It would never have worked. And so in a funny turn of history, that it started off by using the phone lines to have the internet went over the phone lines. Now phone lines go over the internet. There's this sort of flippening, right? And if you think of that same approach, that same mental model, but for value transfer. And so we've got this base layer, which is the Bitcoin ledger, decentralized. I have a miner right next to me here in my office. I've also got a full node. And that is, on that full node, I have a copy of the Bitcoin blockchain. That's the ledger of truth that all transactions are settled on.
So the single source of truth does reside in Wellington. We've established that. That's good.
Yes. And so I have that copy, but along with hundreds of thousands, if not millions of others. And so we have consensus on what that source of truth looks like. Now, to transact on that, that's every 10 minutes that is updated. On average, every 10 minutes, that blockchain ledger gets updated. My node gets updated. Everyone else's does. That's a little bit slow. For doing a micro transaction. If you want to swipe your credit card, it feels like that's actually a bit faster, even though in a roundabout way it takes a lot longer, a couple of days. So
it's like dial-up internet, really, a dial-up internet over copper lines analogy, right there, right?
Yeah, and that's good, and you can still use that to send large value, and I would if you're going to be settling between banks and nation states in the future, the Bitcoin ledger, which everyone can verify for themselves what it says, that's where you would use that. However, in the last few years, we've seen the emergence of some of this layer 2 technology. And so the Lightning Network is one example of that. And so Bitcoin, the base layer, the protocol is what the TCP/IP, the cables under the sea are for the internet. The layer 2 is what the web is. And the layer 2, something like the Lightning Network, is still using Bitcoin, but it sort of is floating above that. And so you can have these microtransactions which have pretty much no fees. They're instantaneous, as the name suggests. And you can use those for, even like sending one Satoshi, or in fact, I believe you can even send fractions of a single Satoshi, which at the moment, it'd be like 0.1 cents. It's a minuscule amount of value, but you can send that without having to spend $3 in fees on a credit card. So what that's enabled now is that I can but that's what I would use to buy a coffee. Now, I'm not going to use the base chain. Once upon a time, people used the base chain to do that, and you still can. That's fine. But in the future, that base chain is going to be reserved for, huge nation states, huge companies, people like you and I who have got into Bitcoin at this point are going to be able to use that. But for your average person, they're probably going to have a Lightning wallet. Something, maybe even ANZ and Westpac put out their own Lightning wallets that are custodial, however they want to do it. That's what most people are going to be using. And what it enables, though, is, for example, my podcast. People listening to my podcast on apps like Fountain or Breeze, or there's a bunch of others, they're actually able to stream value to me as they listen. And so they can send 10 Satoshis, 100 Satoshis, kind of like, we don't even have a concept for it in fiat world, but it's like you're giving. I'm giving value. We call it value for value. I'm giving you value as you listen. The listener gives me value back, and I do that as well. When I listen to other people's podcasts, I stream a certain amount every minute, and they get that, and it's instant and final that they receive that value. And
how does that work though? Like you mentioned that when you're listening, you might go, "Wow, I really love that point. I'm gonna give him 10 sats over the Lightning Network." How do you actually do that?
So there's two ways of doing it. So you can either just set it. It's like it just automatically starts streaming as you click play on a podcast. It will just start sending satoshis. But you can also boost. And you can, maybe you want to do like 50,000 sats, and be a bit of a baller. You can actually send a larger amount, but I just have it set on default to send a certain amount every minute,
right?
And it just runs in the background, and it's because I don't mind sending that. It's a micro.
Where is it set though? Like when you say you've set it just to set like a regular amount, is it set on your podcast player that you're listening through, or?
Yeah. So if I listen to a podcast, I can just show you that there. So in the top, there's the little lightning button, and you just tap that, and you say 10 or 20 or 100 sats per minute. And as I click play, and as every minute that goes past, it will just stream that value. We don't have a concept for it in fiat, so it's quite new.
Yeah. But is that a different app that you're listening to podcasts on that has that Lightning function built into it, or does Spotify have that functionality?
Spotify doesn't have it yet. Right. So as I said, you've got to use something like Fountain or Breeze, or you can look for podcasting. So we call this whole concept Podcasting 2.0, and there's a bunch of apps out there that do it already. I think I can put some links in the show notes, but there's a couple of websites that give you a breakdown of the different apps that you can use. But I think what we will see over time is that maybe some will be faster than others to adopt this functionality. But Spotify could actually enable this because it's all based on the RSS feed of the podcast. So all they have to do is implement it. They don't have to do anything special. It's not like it's not a centralized system. That's the thing. Like, it's an open protocol, and so anyone who wants to enable support for this can. They just have to update their apps, So
it's kind of cutting their own lunch out of it, probably to a certain degree, right? But not really. It's kind of going on top of their revenue model rather than disrupting it, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I also sort of look at it as well, like for your own show. I had another podcast that I was running for about a year, looking at creativity in a chaotic world just throughout the lockdown era. It was really important for me to just kind of talk about that stuff. And I mean, I never made a single dollar off the actual podcast. I was able to do some kind of secondary monetization, but I imagine it's similar for yourself. You do financial advice and that people listen to your show, but in terms of actually making money directly from the show, it's not really an option at the moment, is it?
Not really, no.
And that's, I think, a real shame. Whereas, I've been very fortunate that people are able to support my podcast, and it's early days at the moment, and I'm not expecting it. I'm not trying to grow it quickly because I'm trying to focus on signal and high quality content. But people have already supported me quite a lot through the show. They stream satoshis, they boost it, they share it with their friends. And I'm like, man, I
would listen to one of your podcasts using. I must maybe it was embedded on your website perhaps, but I listened to it and I could see that people from all over the world were streaming value to you by sending you some sats using this functionality, and there was like the ability to do messaging through it as well, right?
Yeah. It's powerful, and it's a paradigm shift. And this is what I was saying before about that hyperglobal micro matrix where we've got people all over the world sending, 1, 10, 100 satoshis, all less than $1 in value, really. But they're signaling that they are getting value from what I'm doing, and they're wanting to support that. And I think this is where I get a bit meta, and I look at, well, what's happening in terms of the internet and what's happening in terms of our civic involvement. You look at something like Instagram. What is it like? You're tapping like, you've got the little heart there, but no one wins from that. The only people who benefit are Instagram. The creator, I never made a single dollar. I've got a pretty decent Instagram following. I never made a single dollar through Instagram. I made money off selling stuff by linking to my website and that sort of thing. But in terms of the ads and the millions and billions of dollars that were made by Facebook, I never had any ownership of that.
Totally get it. Yeah. It's like, show me the money. Like, I don't care about these little love heart emojis.
Yeah. And what the Lightning Network and value for value kind of posits as kind of a move towards authenticity is that you tap that like button, you're going to send 10 Satoshis, 100 Satoshis. And there's a few other websites that have already implemented this really well. And it's really early days at the moment. But I feel like, especially for Gen Z, for younger people who are digital natives, they're going to just be like, yep, this is what I want. And I think that's the other big consideration here, is that you're looking at it through a certain lens. Your clients, I imagine, are a certain demographic, generally speaking. But you also have to look at the emergent demographic. People, we had it tough growing up in, the financial crisis, but look at Gen Z. They've just come out of this COVID stuff, the lockdowns, 7-8% inflation, global crisis, wars, nuclear apocalypse. They've got it pretty bad as well. And it's like, what are they going to do? What's their response going to be? They're looking for authenticity. They're looking for that real connection. And I think, if hopefully I've answered your question, but like, I believe this sort of technology enables that connection between people for value transfer.
No, I get it. And I think that, like if you want to relate to the natives, learn their language. Don't beat them over the head with the book and say, learn mine, you ignorant pygmy, right? Like it's got to be us coming to them, right? So I'm talking now as a financial advisor within a community which is male, pale, and stale, right? To use a really overused term, and it's a little bit derogatory, so forgive me for those other pale, male, and stale advisors out there, but we're not necessarily talking the language of the next generation of clients that we're supposedly supposed to serve. I just blows my mind the distance between what you just said and what we in the industry talk about and what we concern about. We're concerned about regulation. We're concerned about disruption and how to keep the status quo going despite these challenges. It's just so myopic and singular. It's just tiny thinking. Whereas what you're describing is a future where it's not just decentralized protocols that enable value transfer over a blockchain network. You're talking about actual people, and what you're actually really talking about is you're talking about the free market.
Yeah,
that's what you're talking about, aren't you? People that get value are willing to give value in exchange.
Yeah, and
a lot, right?
Having experimented with it and used it, I'm absolutely convinced that this is the future. Like I believe we're seeing a reaction to, broadly speaking, globalization. We're seeing a pushback towards local markets, this hyper-local thing. I want to go out of my way to support people around me, build communities. I don't want to be nameless and faceless. I want to be part of a community. And this is, I'm not Gen Z, but I can feel that from people around me who are. And it's kind of a pushback. And it's this sort of yin and yang, this the tidal waves of history, come and go. And I think what was relevant for people now who, maybe your demographic, they came up in a system where fiat worked. Whether it was the 80s, 90s, early 2000s, whatever, the system worked, the recipe worked. The recipe doesn't work anymore, and people are finding ways to get around that. And whether that's people working digitally, remote work, they happen to be in New Zealand, but they're not really engaged. New Zealand companies don't interest them. Or people living globally. The couple I spoke to yesterday living in El Salvador, a Kiwi couple from Nelson, they work and live over there and they love it. And we're seeing this, I think, these questions being asked around, well, what is the nation? What is the country? Because I will always be a New Zealander at heart. I love this country, but am I under the fiefdom of the Labour government, under the fiefdom of the national government? I don't know. These aren't my people. They certainly don't represent me. They're supposed to, but I'm not feeling like there's a connection there. And it's not it's not something that can be fixed politically, I think.
Right.
We can lower the voting age, but that's not going to change anything.
No. And I think, politicians will use that, what you just said, to their advantage to gain control. But you're right. Like I've always been probably also one of those people on the outside looking in, never naturally part of the in crowd. But ironically or perversely, I don't know, depending how you look at it, I've seen that as an asset, yet an asset that I've never really been able to get a return on up until lately.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that I'm, stinking wealthy out of being an outsider at all. I'm not saying that yet, but I am saying that I can see that for myself. being someone with an original voice who doesn't want to just go control, copy, paste somewhere else and regurgitate the status quo. I'm looking to innovate and disrupt and be a pioneer of sorts in any area that I can get involved in, right?
Yeah.
And that surely must be a common denominator between what you're describing and what I kind of feel on my end, right? Like there's this uprising, I guess you could say, or a seed of an uprising that's in place, perhaps. And there's some sort of connection there between those that have always been marginalized or on the outside. And it's not necessarily a violent thing that's going to take place, but it's a choice thing that's going to take place, isn't it? And so long as we have the choice, and yet that might be limited, but so long as we have a choice, we can actually leave our country without leaving our country if we don't like it, or we can leave our job without leaving our job or our neighborhood or whatever because of technology, right?
Yeah, and I want to be very clear about this. Bitcoin is a peaceful revolution, and I'm not even sure if revolution is the right word, but it is a peaceful opt-in system. I think I've been thinking about this a lot lately. The challenges that we're going to face with increased inflation, cost of living, politically motivated division of people, all of that is because of the fiat system. And I believe that the inevitable challenges that we might face, and whether that ends up being something on the street, which I hope it doesn't in this country, but we're seeing that in places like France right now. I hope it doesn't come to that, but if it does, that will be absolutely because of the cost of living crisis, because of people feeling marginalized and disenfranchised from the fiat system. However, Bitcoin is not. It's an option that sits at the end of that people can say, well, look, we don't actually need to go and pick up the brick, because all we need to do is get a cell phone, get Wallet with Satoshi, start using Bitcoin, maybe start working for Bitcoin, start putting a bit in, start earning Bitcoin. And it's that optionality. And I think the human nature, which is another important thing, I think there's a lot of nihilism and apathy around. And ultimately, Bitcoin is hope for me. And it certainly helped me get through the last few years of chaos. But it doesn't ask you to do anything. It doesn't coerce you to do anything. It doesn't tax you. It doesn't regulate you. It just says, look, do what you need to do. And it believes that there is a fundamental, some fundamental rules that we agree on in terms of fixed supply. But beyond that, you do you. And I believe in that system, the best of humanity can emerge. And that's, not everyone agrees with that, but that's certainly been my belief. And I think I've seen that validated in real life. Some of the Bitcoiners I know are the best people, the most generous people I know with their time. Have you found that as well?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Like, especially the clients that reach out to me that are already orange pilled, like they'll come to me. They'll be probably the most authentic, open-minded, generous people that I've ever met. No, I shouldn't say that I've ever met. Some of the most open-minded and generous people I've ever met.
Yeah.
And it's it's an antidote to looking at crisis, because that crisis opportunity thing. It really is. There's two sides to a coin. You can focus on the negative or the positive. Do both.
Yeah.
Do both with bravery. Like go in there and actually see things for as they are, but know that there is hope on each side of this crisis, right?
There's hope, and I think that's something that's really important, again, to underscore, is that a lot of young people, people my age who have got this apathy, this fear, this, especially with some of the global events that are happening, war, climate change, all of these things, it sows a lot of fear and a lot of anxiety. And when you realize, and there's a bit more to this, but you realize that a lot of these problems are driven by, and this sounds a bit revolutionary, but are driven by fiat systems.
Totally.
The way if you just look, there was a release just of the Pentagon leak the other day, and it's like, you can see just how heavily involved the United States is in the war with Russia.
Absolutely. This is a currency war. It's not. I shouldn't say this is just a currency war. It's not just about that, I know, but you look at 1971, look at the U.S. the petrodollar system. Yeah. It's all money. My generation, Gen X, was taught to think that it was all about greed. It was all about the love of money, right? No, it's about the system itself, the self-preservation that occurs within that pyramid scheme. Yeah, there's a reason why there's a pyramid on those dollar bills, right? It really is a pyramid scheme.
Yeah, well, and look, I mean, and there's a bit to that, and a lot of people. I mean, we're talking frankly here, and I mean, a lot of people think, I don't think so, but I think there's at least a grain of truth to some of these ideas that This isn't apples for apples. It's there's something going on, and what Bitcoin posits is that, well, at the very least, something's going on, but you can verify for yourself if you have a full node or you jump on the blockchain, have a look. You can see what's going on. You can see all of the transactions there. You don't know who they are, but you know that, hey, there's a fixed amount of money. There's at least a grain of truth to there is truth that can be found in that. And I think some
it's
of them
knowable. Yeah, it's knowable, isn't it?
Yeah, and you can check for yourself. And I think one of the other challenges we're facing as well is maybe this affects, again, this is a generational thing, but my trust in the media is zero, if not negative. My stuff is just down the road from us, and we've got Radio New Zealand up on the terrace, and it's like, yeah, these institutions are, bless their souls, but they are full of shit. And I don't know. I don't even think about listening to what they have to say. And every now and then, in a cafe, I might have a look at the Dom Post and say what it's trying to say. And I think, okay, this isn't the news. This is what they're trying to tell me. And a lot of young people, I think, are on the same boat. And
is that Cody? Is that something that you think is just a bunch of people too dumb to realize that they're being suckered in by disinformation? Or is this actually just, no, we've had a guts full of it and we can actually see this now clearly?
I think they're sophisticated, and they know. And it's like, if you want the news, seriously, if you want the news, go to Reddit and go to Twitter. That's where it's at. And, the Pentagon leaks, whatever you want to find out about, it's all there. And you've got people doing breakdowns and, the people, compared to who's writing the articles, for New Zealand media at the least, the level of detail and research and the sources and the backing that you get from, decentralized media is far superior to what the news is able to do.
Yeah.
And even the bastions, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, just the stuff they say about Bitcoin even, it's like, man, this is like basic mistakes that are wrong, And so I think there's also that element that we live in this post-truth society, and this sounds a bit woo-woo, but from my perspective, for Gen Z, for younger people, it's like, yeah, that's all I've ever known, is that the media is full of shit. And so, and pardon my French, but like they then automatically, they're like inoculated against that, and they're like, oh yeah, but for older people, and I look at, say, my grandparents, they religiously watch TV1 news. And bless their soul, but like, they don't know any better, and I can't convince them otherwise. My own parents are sort of in between that, but it's like, if you watch Channel 1 News, it's like, yo, we got bad thing in the world, a little good thing, and then sport and the weather. That's the format, and it's like a little entertainment, a little thing every night, and you feel, go on your way and you think you know what's going on in the world, but at the very same time, we've got things like Bitcoin happening, which get zero coverage, if not just a few cursory mentions.
Yeah.
And that's actually changing the world. We've got things like AI, which I don't know if you've sort of looked into that very much, but that is changing the world right now.
Definitely. Yeah. Massively. And I guess that's the thing, right? Like, what we're talking about here is we're talking about the signs and symptoms of what probably is the biggest transfer of wealth that will ever occur between those that inoculate themselves with the truth or not, right? Like, it's there's going to be this transition of wealth and power and influence that will happen, I think, anyway.
Yeah. Again,
it's about the first shall be last and the last shall be first.
Yeah, and
I think,
and look, I think it's also important to sort of temper these conversations. It's the word truth. I think is a bit of a trigger word. It's a powerful word.
What is truth? What is truth, Cody?
Yeah, well, I think people, what is justice? What is truth? These kinds of questions, which I've sort of taken upon myself to really investigate. I always talk about this, but I'm going through the Republic again and again, reading Plato, reading the classics, reading and understanding that this is not a new problem. It's not a new question. And we have this kind of contemporary bias where we think that we've got it the best that it will ever be. But I'll tell you, the Romans and the Greeks knew a thing. The people in the Renaissance and the Enlightenment knew a thing or two. And we do know a few things here as well, but we've also forgotten a lot. And so, talking about what is truth, what is not truth, I say, hey, look, just verify for yourself. And I don't recommend anyone invest in Bitcoin. I don't even like using that word invest. I like saying to people, hey, do your own research, go online, or talk to someone, get a book. The Bitcoin Standard is a great one. There's a couple of others. The Bullish Case for Bitcoin is a great little PDF pamphlet that you can read that gives a high-level overview. Do your research. Learn about what it is. don't take anyone's word for it, because I don't know. I certainly don't know anything, if I was to sort of quote Socrates, but none of us do. And I mean, unfortunately, I mean, I mean, it's your job to provide some of that advice, and I think that that's understandable. I mean, the existing financial system's so complex that you kind of need specialists to help you through it, and that's, obviously you've done really successfully with that. But with Bitcoin, all I say is to people is do your own research. Don't trust me. Find out what you think is truth. And then we can reconvene and connect through that.
Yeah, no, that's I've learned so much having this chat. It feels like I know you reached out to me and you wanted me to be on your show, but it kind of feels like you're kind of on my show and I'm drilling you, because there's just so much interesting perceptions that you have, and I wonder, I'm just curious, like maybe your creative wiring has enabled you to see things a little bit differently. Would that be true in your case?
I think so. As I said earlier before the show, my background is photography. I've done a lot of writing. I've traveled quite a lot. I photograph places. So my work's all about architecture and buildings and places. And part of that journey is sort of meeting people along the way. And in a way, what I've been able to do, I'm always about trying to connect what I do in my life together. And, Bitcoin was kind of over here and my photography and creative work was over here. But what I've been able to do is connect them together and say, well, actually, I can walk through the shanty towns of Bangkok. I can walk through Shanghai. I can walk through Tokyo, and I can analyze and understand how this place emerged, this city, this machine of civilization, because how it relates to the economics. You can look at the skyline. Someone told me about how, you can look at the skyline of Tokyo and you can see 1989 and the stock market crash in the skyline. You can see the war in the skyline because it's the areas where there's no skyscrapers, where there's flat earth, and I think these kinds of meta concepts, which is really what my show is about, the transformation of value, is there's some technical details of Bitcoin that you can research and learn about, but what I'm really interested in is some of those philosophical and artistic considerations, because this is it's a cultural revolution as much as a technology revolution. And
no, you're touching on all the things that I've kind of, my intellectualism, I guess you could say, would stop me from being able to go there. But like, I just, this fascinates me because I know that traditionally people like me would probably look at people like you artsy fartsy types, and you don't know anything. Just shut up and get this index fund, right? Yeah. So this is why I think, like, it's just such a powerful example. You are a powerful example of what everyday investors could be, especially those that feel like they've been locked out, because you actually do have the keys. Like Oz didn't give nothing to the Tin Man that he didn't already have, right? Like you've got the keys already to get it. You understand it.
Yeah.
If you can understand this far better than I can understand it already, by the looks of it, there's so much hope for those that feel locked out, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, the keys is the perfect analogy. I mean, Bitcoin, when people listening set up a Bitcoin wallet, you generate a private key, which is your key to your money. No one else has it except you, and you have to take responsibility for that. There's no big bank to bail you out. There's no one who's going to come and save you. And so there's a certain degree of personal responsibility, which I think in part feeds to a lot of these social issues and broader themes that we're seeing. If you take responsibility for yourself and then those around you and then your community and then your country in that order, put your own mask on first before you help others, right, yeah. As they say on the airplanes. I think we can see a lot of positive change, and I think that's sort of the reactionism to big government and just kind of being mandated and told what to do, from everything from what trees I can cut down on my property through to how much income tax and capital gains tax I pay and that sort of thing. So there's a lot of these questions and fundamentals, and I think looking at even just what's going on, I mean, I think we've just had the OCR for 50 basis points. And I look at that and I think, this is the most archaic thing I've ever seen. This is like using leeches or, like a hacksaw to amputate a limb, and it's like, there's a better way. Why do we not have clarity on our monetary policy in this country? What's it going to be in 3 months? Are they going to put it up again? And it's like, we're all on edge. If we just knew that there's 21 million Bitcoin, every 10 minutes there's a small amount comes online as people mine it, but it's a known quantity that comes online. If we had that clarity, imagine how far in the future we could plan. And I think yeah, it's all connected, and I think as a creative person, I sort of bring it all together, and then I sort of like synthesize it.
Yeah.
And I don't have anything against people who are more technical or more logical in the sense of how they look at it either, because we can work together. I can't code very well, but certainly people who can, maybe they can work on Bitcoin businesses. They can build wallet software, that sort of thing. So there's a role for everyone, I believe, in this.
Yeah. Here's a wacky question for you. Yeah. You think like the likes of, say, Socrates, Plato, Pascal, maybe they're Satoshi Nakamoto, right? Like, did they invent Bitcoin? Like, do you think it would have been possible for them to invent some sort of decentralized ledger system back in ancient Greece, let's say, where people could interact value with?
Well, I think Bitcoin, the white paper came out in 2008, but it was built upon the shoulders of a lot of other work. Are you familiar with the cypherpunks? Have you heard of that?
A little bit, and like Halfpenny and stuff like that.
Yeah, so you had this group of people, pretty much from like the 80s onwards, working with cryptography, working with decentralized systems. People like Adam Back, Halfpenny, these different people who built a lot of the moving parts. Satoshi did a lot, but he didn't do everything. And a lot of these moving parts that power Bitcoin, were from a long time ago, and a lot of the ideas that informed it come from ancient times. I think you look at the idea of justice, freedom, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment. I mean, it's human civilization and the development of civilization that has led us to these ideas. And to throw that away and say, well, you know what, we've had thousands of years of understanding what freedom is and what justice is, but we just don't need that anymore because we're a bit scared that the big bad guy is going to come get us, and so we need the government to look after us. It's like at no point is that ever worked out for anybody, that the government's going to save you from the big bad guy. It's like you have to look at it from that historical lens, and I think
what is this blasphemy I'm listening to from someone in Wellington? Wow.
Yeah. I don't work for the government, luckily, so I stand out like a sore thumb. But hey, I absolutely think Socrates would have been a Bitcoiner. He probably would have given it away if he had it. I think the idea of Bitcoin is a powerful idea. It's an idea of freedom, of self-sovereignty, and I think it's ultimately better for humanity in the long term. And I see some of the challenges we're facing with the environment, with sustainability, with all of these things, which kind of get captured by fiat thinking, and they're like, well, we're just going to stop driving cars and stop eating food, and we're all going to die. And it's like, no, actually, we can build a better world, and we can use technology and human innovation, and we can see a renaissance in thought, I think, where people aren't scared. They're not scared of other people in other countries. They're not, they're not trying to hurt each other, trying to work together. Because if you can trade seamlessly between people globally, then you're probably not going to fight. It's when you start playing with the money and you start messing with trade tariffs and all of that stuff that you start making people want to fight. And I think, fix the money, fix the world.
That's such a good title for this episode, man.
Yeah.
Look at that.
Right. Well, thank you.
Whoever thought of that?
Yeah. No, thank you, Darcy. It's been good. I appreciate you're a great interlocutor, and I think it's been good to sort of bridge as well, sort of your world as well, with the work you do with financial advice, and some of the people you talk to with sort of my world, which is a little bit more fluid, I guess you could say, a bit more artsy-fartsy, but there is a commonality. Yeah.
I think like the common threads are totally there, right? Like there are lines of communication open, right? And I think that's kind of what people like you, people like me, we need to keep doing is just keep the lines of communication open, regardless of what goes down those lines, because change is coming.
Yeah. So look, my takeaway would be for anyone, look, do your own research. Don't trust me. Don't trust Darcy. Or sorry, I mean, you trust Darcy.
No, don't trust me either.
He's a professional, but do your own research. Look into it. Bitcoin, not crypto. Bitcoin's all you need to be looking at. Everything else, it's not worth your time. Look at Bitcoin. Do a bit of research. See if you're interested. Look online, reach out to someone if you've got any questions, but it's pretty straightforward. It's pretty easy to get involved. It only takes a little bit, and before you know it, you'll be self-sovereign and you'll be a Bitcoiner. So that's all I would say to people. Thank you very much.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I'll echo that. Amplify it by 10. That's great. Thank you very much, Cody.